All right, so good evening. Thanks to those who've joined, and for those who watch, appreciate you taking the time. Welcome to Poliventure. This is our second workshop of the day. We only have two, so it's not like so many of them. And what I'll do is I'll walk through the schedule and then about this workshop, and then start to get into some of the major concepts that we'll be utilizing for the next 8 weeks for Poliventure. So our schedule for the class or for the workshop is as follows. So we meet every Wednesday from 8 o'clock to 8:30. So obviously these are the dates listed. Today's our first one, Wednesday, June 16th, and we'll go all the way through to August 4th. For week one, will be an overview to give a sense of what this workshop is and the different concepts that we'll be engaging with. So this is a new workshop series that explores how games relate to concepts in political science. I'll be live streaming games such as Risk board game or Sid Meier's Civilization, and discussing how different elements of the game relate to political science theories, concepts, and other elements. If you have an idea for live streaming and discussing politics, you're welcome to email me to reserve a workshop to do so. So for those of you who are maybe aspiring teachers and you want to say, I would want to use this game in my classroom to teach students a historical concept. Or if you're, let's say, a biology major and you want to see how games like the pandemic, quote unquote pandemic or evolution have political science concepts attached to them, we can play those too. So the idea is really just to show that the games that we play, that we enjoy, either as young people or as old people or as somewhere in between, really can help demonstrate and bring to light concepts that we use in the discipline of political science. Now, when it comes to political science, there's basically three elements to the discipline. And obviously there's more, like it's the scientific study of things and the like, but I want to point these out in the context of this workshop. The first one is the study of who gets what, when, where, how, and why. These are all elements of politics in the sense of who's doing what are they doing, when are they doing it, where are they taking actions, how are they going about taking those actions, and why would they take those types of actions. And we ask these questions because it helps to not just see politics through maybe a partisan lens, like, oh, a Democrat, Republican, or through some ideological lens, like democratic, communism, or things of that nature. But it helps us think about more thoroughly the individuals, the groups, the institutions that are involved in shaping policies and shaping outcomes that obviously have an effect on people, whether at the local level, the state level, the national level, or at the international level. Political science is also the study of power. So who has it, who wants it, who's trying to get it, and in what ways. Power is a concept that can be broken into two general ones. The first one is what we call hard power, which are things like muscle or being in a leadership position or having the strongest military and things of that nature. We also have a second element of power called soft, which are things like culture, the ability to persuade through communication, tangible things that shape how people think and act and behave. The last element I want to bring to your attention is the study of strategic interaction between political actors. For those of you in the 130 course or international relations, you'll explore strategic interaction in more detail in the sim. But for us in general, strategic interaction is basically why do two people interact and how do they interact given what they expect the other person to do. And I'll give a couple examples later with some games that can come to light. But the study of strategic interaction between political actors is something that political science has obviously taken some sense of ownership over, and it builds on work that's been done in economics and how economic actors strategically interact. Like, how do two businesses decide to compete with each other? In this case, we, instead of looking at businesses, we'll say, how do two politicians decide to compete with each other, and so on. Now, for the different games, I just list them here Obviously, I'm open if you have a board game that you've played in the past, and it can be any board game. So if you want to throw out Candyland or something like cool or Shoots and Ladders, we can do that, because I will be able to map on uh, elements of that game to these four concepts that we'll be focusing on. So here's just a list of games that I grew up with: Battleship, Axis and Ally, Civilization, Risk, Diplomacy, Stratego. And I kind of chuckle when I say this because I just have memories of playing these games with friends and how like things like sometimes were really fun and other times like they just, were a disaster. So it's fun to think about the games and the camaraderie that they help establish, the relationships they can strain at times, but just the fun that you have with interacting with others. And obviously times have changed. So when I was playing board games, a lot, it was like in high school, we didn't have like, I don't know, iPhones and iPads and like the internet in any meaningful way. So things have changed. So you can like play these games online now with others. So if you have other games that you want to like help analyze, feel free to post them in the chat, or to send me an email or to send me a Canvas message, and we can go ahead and do that for one of the workshops. Now, you're asking yourself, games and political science, like how do you bridge that together? Well, there's four concepts that we'll be using for and applying them to each game that we play. The first one's communication. The second is information. The third is strategy. And the last one is moves. And what I'll do is I'll walk through each of these. So for communication, I may increase the font size here because it's paltry. So for communication, there's two types, direct and indirect. And the idea is like, if you can communicate directly with somebody in a game, you're obviously able to share information, knowledge relatively quickly without any impediment. Other types of games, you're communicating indirectly. And that means you can't tell a person what you're doing, but you can take an action and then they can see what you're doing. And then they can see that as a form of communication. So it's indirect because you're not using either your words or your, say, if you sign, you're not using a direct communication with the person. You're communicating with them through the game that you're playing. And so every game can either have elements of direct communication, indirect communication, or a combination of the two. And so when we play games, we'll talk about what kind of communication is predominant in it and what it means for the nature of the game and how people would go about playing it. The second concept is information. And this can be categorized into two types, complete and incomplete information. So complete information is when you know everything that's basically going on except what's going on in the player's mind, because obviously that's something you cannot observe directly unless they, I don't know, like are just constantly communicating their thoughts outwardly so that you're like, oh, okay, I know what they're thinking because they're saying it out loud. So complete information is when everything is known, most things are known about the game except the player's thought process or what's going on in their head. Incomplete information is when there's some aspect of the game that is missing. So a couple of examples. Obviously, you don't know what's going on in someone's head, so that can contribute to an incomplete game. If you can't see the entire board, that's an incomplete game. If you can see how they're moving some pieces or some elements of the game, but not others, then that's an incomplete game. If you have to rely on beliefs of the player because you can't see exactly what they're doing, you just see the outcome of it, that's an incomplete game. So most games would be viewed as incomplete because there's some information missing from the process. But there are elements of games that would help reach it or to help it to achieve completion. So for example, when you can see the whole board game, that's more or less complete because you can see all the moves the players are taking with no loss of knowledge. The next concept is strategy. And there's two types. There's cooperative and there's competitive. So when you think of games, obviously I'm talking in the context of like a board game or some kind of computer game, but we can kind of take a step back and say, let's think of other games in general that maybe we played growing up. So for example, you might have played, I don't know, sport like baseball, basketball, soccer, etc. Now, most people would argue that those are competitive because there's one side and the other side. But some people would argue that they're cooperative within the team, right? Your team needs to work together in order to accomplish its goal of being a competitive element or object or team against another one. And so you can have different strategies. And one of them is to work together or be cooperative, or the other is to be competitive, which is work against each other. Now, obviously, you can have a combination of these two depending on how you look at a particular game. One thing that comes to mind growing up was playing Red Rover. I don't know if you're familiar with this type of game, but it's like, you know, you're stand in a line and there's a line on the other side of the field or on the say on a court of some type, and you lock hands with your side and you then swing them back and forth and you say Red Rover, send someone from the other side right over. And that person's goal is to run through the link on your side. So in a sense, you're cooperating with your team because you're holding hands. It's competitive in a sense that someone's coming towards you, but the idea is that if they join your team, then they help make your groups stronger or larger, and then the team that has the most obviously wins, or at least has two. So that had elements of both competitive and cooperative. So when we look at these games, we'll ask ourselves that question, like, is it a cooperative type of game where the players need to work together in order to accomplish a goal? Or is it a competitive game where they are in conflict with each other and therefore one is going to have to win and the other one's going to have to lose? Now, the last element or concept that we'll keep in mind as we look through these different games over the next few weeks are moves. And so there's two types. There's simultaneous and there's sequential. So simultaneous is when both players move at the exact same time. And sequential is when one player moves first, the other player moves second, the next, the following player moves third, and then you back and forth. So simultaneous games are things like rock, paper, scissors, which we'll demonstrate in a moment. And then sequential games are like checkers, chess, Go, those types of games. So knowing that the way moves are done makes a difference for the nature of the game and for how people would play it. So what I'd like to do is just highlight two examples, and then we'll stop the recording and have a discussion for those who are attending. The first game is rock, paper, scissors. Now, I shared this because I think it's something we're all familiar with. So if you want to give like a thumbs up or post in the chat that, yes, you are familiar with rock, paper, scissors, that'd be helpful. Awesome. So in this game, there's three players, right? There's rock, there's paper, there's scissors. And the uniqueness of this game is that it's simultaneous. So we'll say simultaneous. And the goal is as follows, right? If you're rock, you don't want to lose to paper. If you're paper, you don't want to lose to scissors. And if you're scissors, you don't want to lose to rock. Now, even though there's three types of players, this game only needs to be played with two people because each person can decide which of the three types they're gonna be. And because it's a simultaneous game, you don't know what the other player is gonna be until that last moment where they have to reveal, whether they're the rock type, the paper type, or the scissor type. And so I won't demonstrate this here, but find a friend, pause the video, or just take a moment and play this game, and then you'll see the notion of moves, in this case, them being simultaneous. The second game I like to point out is Tic Tac Toe. So again, if we can get a thumbs up or a note in the chat about if you're familiar with this game, great. So Tic Tac Toe has two players, right? O and X. And what's unique about this game is that there's a first mover, right? One of these two players gets to go first, which makes this a sequential game because they're not moving at the same time. Now, obviously, the goal of this game is to get three O's or 3 X's in a row. And what we'll do is demonstrate that this game is one where the equilibrium or the outcome is typically a deadlock. If both players are playing with complete information, which they are, because you can see the board, they're playing sequentially, obviously, because one goes before the other, that this game should always end in a tie, basically, right? No player should ever be able to win this game, assuming both players don't make any errors in that process. And so just noodle that for a bit. Again, find a friend, a family member, and be like, let's play Tic Tac Toe 10 times and let's see what happens. If you're as good as they are, which means neither of you make errors, each of those 10 games will end up as a tie, because that's how this game is structured. Now, the reason sometimes you might win or sometimes you might lose is because you made an error in the process of choosing where to position your X or your O. And so with these two types of games, they're very rudimentary. They're the ones that we grow up with, that we start off with. The other one I was thinking of was Thumb War. If you ever played those, I play that pretty consistently with my wife and now son. We played Thumb War. Each of these have different elements. So in the following week, we'll talk about a specific game, but I'll come back and show how these 4 concepts map onto these 2 childhood games. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pause or stop the recording, and then we'll have our discussion, and we'll call it a night. So for those watching, thanks.